you ready?
I am ready.
Great. Hi, I'm Stienberg. Welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News Save Hyatt. I have Dr. Darren Zook from the University of California, Berkeley, and he's here in Singapore to visit the Singapore Management University. And he's back from many wonderful trips, including Myanmar, and which we'll be asking Dr. Darren Zook about the updates and what's happening in Myanmar after the elections and his views of what's to come here in Southeast Asia. Dr. Darren, welcome to the National Critics' Choice.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
And yes, please tell us what's happening in Myanmar.
Well, that's a big question. It depends on whether you mean today or whether you mean since the elections or before the elections. A lot is definitely happening. Politically, of course, the big question everyone had is whether the democratic reforms that are currently happening that led up to the elections and the democratic reforms that are continuing after the elections are actually substantive. This was the big question. And the more we see them, the more it looks as if they are at least partially substantive, enough that countries like the United States or organizations like the European Union are willing to minimize the sanctions they have placed on Burma for so long. And I think that's a good thing, although it has its own problems as well. We can talk about those later. So the elections were surprisingly free and fair for the most part. There were a handful of irregularities, but not enough to really mar the elections. So the surprising thing is that the elections happened, that the results were respected. Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, won all but one of the seats they contested, and the seat they didn't win is because their candidate was actually disqualified, and they probably would have won that as well. The government respected these results, which was another pleasant surprise, and Aung San Suu Kyi is now working as an opposition politician. She has the freedom to travel, so everything seems to be moving in a positive direction, although I wouldn't also be a naive optimist and think everything is now perfect again.
And speaking about the elections and moving forward with Myanmar, what kind of differences do you see in your observations, with the people that you communicate in Myanmar before and after the elections?
One of the most noticeable things, having been on several trips to Myanmar, is that there is a sense of hope in the air. And that's not just a sense of hope of people who are, say, supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi. There's a real sense of personal freedom that was not there in the past. In the past, you would be in Burma, there would be military personnel on most of the corners. People were going from one location to the other, not talking so much, trying to find a way to survive, but always very aware of the presence of the state. The visit I took during the elections, I was actually quite surprised. It felt like a very different country. You saw people laughing and openly celebrating in streets. You saw things for sale that had been banned for years before. You could buy T-shirts or books of Aung San Suu Kyi right there, on the streets of Yangon. I'd never seen this before, and so you have this real sense that not just supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi, not just people in the National League for Democracy, but most Burmese people are celebrating the partial withdrawal of the state from everyday life. The state is, the military in particular, still has a very heavy presence in politics, but the military presence in the day-to-day functioning of society seems to have gone away, and people have rushed in to fill this void in a very open way.
And speaking of a freer society, is it true that the press today, as well as the political system now, are they eager enough to transform, or are they still remain conservative?
The institutions of civil society, which is what you would expect to strengthen if Burma's democratic transition is going to go through effectively, need to be cultivated and strengthened. And the press is, of course, a central institution of what political scientists call civil society. Having a free press is essential because a free press is, in essence, the mouthpiece of ordinary citizens. Under the military regime in Burma, the press was a mouthpiece for the military. What you do have in Myanmar now is you have a number of new newspapers. So that's an encouraging sign. There's a lot of experiments going on with exactly how much you can get away with. So it used to be you had, the new light of Myanmar. You had government-controlled papers. There was a weird experiment with a couple of independent newspapers a few years back, but the government still was allowed to censor what they didn't like. Now there's a lot of new newspapers. They come out as dailies. They are critical but they're not foolish enough to be directly confrontational. So they wouldn't denounce the military, for instance, but they were reporting openly on, say, the National League for Democracy. So that bodes well for the possibility that Myanmar's press will diversify. And you want that. You'll always have papers that are conservative and perhaps support the military. If the military has its own newspaper, it has a right to do that in a democracy. But you'll also have other papers that are going to be more pro-democracy, perhaps supportive of National League for Democracy, and the idea is that Burmese can choose which newspapers they want to read. And that's how democracy is supposed to function. So you see the seeds of that right already. I mean, the day the elections happened, I brought back a stack of newspapers, just probably 10 different newspapers that were all reporting on the elections, very different coverage from all of them. And that's a good thing to see, as long as at some point the government does not come in and start censoring those again. The other news outlets, which is actually quite interesting, this is something to watch in Burma, is that online news is now opened up in a very big way. There's a new generation of Burmese students who are very savvy about internet things for a variety of reasons. And when you're in, Yangon, when you're in the capital city, for instance, the number of cyber cafes, the number of private and public training institutes to get computer programs is astonishing. I mean, it's tripled, it's quadrupled in probably 2 years. That's going to be another source of information, and that there's much greater potential there, because you'll have users, kind of younger generation users, who are very savvy at getting information out, and you'll have a regime that doesn't have the same technological powers. So that provides a second option in the situation, it hasn't happened yet, but in the situation where, say, the print press is shut down for any reason or censored, the online press can easily jump in.
And speaking about free press and the military, are you saying that the military still has a grip on Myanmar's political scene?
Yes, they do. I mean, this is why you have to be careful about how optimistic you are about these reforms. The constitution that is currently in place still reserves to the military a very large percentage of the seats in the institutions of the government. So the military still calls the shots. Now, Thein Sein is ruling, he's a former military person who is ruling as a civilian. He's kind of the architect of the reforms, and he is trying to negotiate this very intricate balance between making sure he doesn't alienate the military, which may cause them to want to step back in and reclaim more of their power. Foreign powers who are hoping to see more democracy, so he has to keep the military at bay so it looks like civilian democracy is taking over. And also letting parties like the National League for Democracy, which is not the only opposition party, but it's the biggest one, they have to have free space as well. But at the end of the day, the military still controls at least a quarter of the government. Nothing can happen in Burma's political institutions without the direct or indirect approval of the military. So the next phase that people are looking at right now in terms of Burma's democratic transition, is saying, okay, we've got this democratic transition, this looks great, this is promising, it looks substantive, but it could never be complete until the military fully withdraws from government. That's the next big question.
And speaking about the biggest question, is transparency still an issue for the local Myanmarese as well as political scene?
Transparency is, again, the reforms seem to be substantive, and so there is far more transparency now than there has been probably since 1962, when the military really took over in power. But having said that, there's a long way to go. The military still, transparency is caught up with the other big problem that Burma has, which is corruption. Getting the military out of politics is essential for a free and open democracy. That's one thing. But ending corruption is also equally as important. And ending corruption and improving transparency go hand in hand, because citizens have to have access to the workings of government so they can know where corruption exists. Having investigative journalists, having more newspapers is part of improving transparency. But the corruption that has set in place over decades of military rule in Burma, it's just massive. I mean, billions and billions of dollars have been siphoned out of Burma's economy, and it's easy to see. All you have to do is walk around. You can see these you know who has ties to the regimes, because there's these mansions and they stand in stark contrast to the relative poverty of everyone else. So transparency is on the table. Even Thein Sein knows that you got to have, if you want democracy, there's got to be some transparency. But transparency can only be as strong as the battle against corruption. Corruption can always undermine transparency. If you can see what your government's doing, but you can't do anything about it, or you can see what your government's doing and the government can buy you off with a bribe, then you end up in this, what's called an illiberal democracy, a democracy that just never works the way it's supposed to work. So transparency is on the table. Many parties are well aware it has to be improved, but it can only succeed to the extent that Burma comes to grips with the corruption that is so pervasive in its politics and in its economy.
Now, having to move forward, what's happening with the banking and investment sector in Myanmar? Are banks threatened by what is happening right now, or are they seeking reforms? Because I heard that there's a lot of conflicting reports on from banks and institutions that they're trying to dabble with the reforms, especially with the military.
Yeah. Burma's well aware that it needs to go through financial reforms. The protests going all the way back to 1988, that in essence sent Ne Win out of power, and the protests of 2007, you probably saw the footage of the people in the streets. Both of those were, in their origins, protests of frustration over the price of goods and an economy that was corrupt and didn't work. And so again, even the government, even the military is well aware that financial reforms are necessary to create first a stable, then a vibrant economy, so that those kinds of protests don't return. So the government is certainly dabbling with these things. If you've heard those rumors, those are true. When I was there even for the elections, there was all sorts of discussion about perhaps creating a more stable exchange rate for the Chat, the Burmese currency, appointing more talented people to head Burma's state bank and things like this. These are all good steps towards creating an economy that is not just, in essence, a national bank for what the military wants, but an economy with institutions that serve the people of Myanmar. That's a long-term process. And it has to be, that's one of those things that can't be done quickly either, especially in an economic context that is just rife with corruption. If money starts flowing in, if outside donors or the World Bank comes in, and so you have this new bank and you have new reforms, the money flows in, but the corruption has not been dealt with, the money will flow in and it will just disappear and nothing will happen. And that will create its own economic crisis. So the reforms have started, but they will probably keep pace. They'll be quite slow. They will keep pace with the democratic transition. So I mentioned earlier that the end goal, and when I say the end goal, it's kind of from a political science perspective. At the end of the day, you cannot have a military that is a direct part of the government. Democracies never function when that happens. The good news is even the Burmese military knows this. The question is, what is the exit strategy? How long will they stay in power? The military, of course, will try to lengthen that period for the sake of stability. More democratic-minded people, like the National League for Democracy, will want to shorten that. With the financial reforms you're talking about, the trick is going to be all that corruption money, where is that going to go? And my best guess is that somewhere in between all of this, what they will negotiate is they'll negotiate what I call a graceful exit. That, in essence, in exchange for not pursuing charges of corruption against either military leaders or those with direct ties to them, the military therefore can walk with its, whatever it's got, it walks. In exchange for leaving the system and allowing not only the government, but the economic institutions that support the government to pursue actual substantive political and economic reforms. If you get that, then given the fact that Burma does have resources, it's got oil, it's got natural gas, it's got things, a kind of a resource base that it actually could develop. If they're able to minimize corruption, develop the resource base, and have strong financial institutions, Burma could actually see a successful political and economic transition into one of the more vibrant democracies in Southeast Asia. Now again, cautious optimism is my point of view, not naive optimism. This isn't going to happen next year. It's fraught with difficulties.
And what sort of difficulties they are facing? What sort of challenges they are facing actually?
Well, I mean, when you've been under military rule literally since 1962, people aren't used to how democracy works. Burma's exceptional in that, in many cases, what you get are people that are societies where, after decades of military rule, the repression has pretty much broken apart society. So you have to rebuild it from scratch. Example of that would be Iraq. Nobody predicted, or at least no one in, say, the American administration realized that when you break down Saddam Hussein's regime, you can't just put democracy in place because no one knows how does democracy work. That takes years. Burma's interesting because people never forgot, largely because of Aung San Suu Kyi. So they don't have the problem of having to completely retool the political behavior of citizens. But you do have a military that is concerned about stability. Even if they agree to the idea of a graceful exit, they want to make sure they're going to go in a way that protects themselves. They don't want to have long, drawn-out trials. They don't want to be brought up on charges of corruption. That's probably not going to happen. So negotiating that exit, that's one challenge. Controlling corruption, probably the biggest challenge. Controlling corruption is a very, very tricky thing to do, especially when it's as deeply rooted as it is in Burma. Countries that have low levels of corruption each have their own way of doing things. Singapore, for instance, has lower levels of corruption, but its approach to reducing corruption is very, very different than, say, in a country like Iceland or Finland, which also have them. So Burma's going to have to find a model that's going to work. How do you start getting rid of corruption? How do you get corruption levels down? And once they're down, how do you make sure they stay there? That, of course, is part and parcel with the political reforms. You have to be able to build independent institutions, like an anti-corruption commission, for instance. Well, that means empowering civilians at the expense of the military. So you can see how all of these reforms cascade. If you're going to reform the banking sector, that taps into reforming corruption. If you're going to reform corruption, that taps into empowering civilian power at the expense of military power. So these are all separate challenges, but the overarching challenge is that you have to orchestrate these in just the right order. If you undertake banking reforms before you tackle corruption, it might fail. And it would fail because you have all this money flowing in, but corruption is still there, so people are taking money out of the system as fast as it's flowing in. So how do you deal with corruption? But sometimes dealing with corruption, you need the money to be there, so you have to have the financial reforms at the same time. So it's actually very, very difficult to orchestrate the multiple sector reform that Burma needs to make a successful transition. Is it impossible? No, but it's very, very tricky. The last thing I'll say on that is that people often want democracies to settle down overnight. You'll see this in Egypt. We have elections, we've got democracy, everything should work better. Anytime you have a transition like this, it takes, my conservative estimate is a generation. Democracies work well, but they have to be cultivated. So this is not going to be a case where Aung San Suu Kyi is in power now, and by next year, she's going to have everything fixed. She alone can't fix it. No one person can. And these reforms aren't going to take 6 months. They're not going to take 3 months. They're going to take 10 years. And yet another complicating factor will be to see if figures like Aung San Suu Kyi and other National League for Democracy members, and even Thein Sein, can convince the people of Burma, even when the reforms, there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be scandals, bad things will happen, to convince the people of Burma that the system is still worth supporting. Because voters tend to get very frustrated when things don't change quickly.
And speaking about reforms, let's go to the issue of human rights. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of issue and talk about human rights in Myanmar, and equality for women and children especially, and the poor who are working in the rice fields and so forth, and even as far as education is concerned. What's happening right now? Are there any form of human rights that is able to assist these people?
There's no direct human rights challenge yet, in the sense that the government itself has not made human rights a priority and set up an institution that says, okay, deal with human rights. We don't have that. It might happen at some point, soon enough. Usually human rights bodies like that are set up as independent watchdogs of the government, but that's a huge leap in civilian empowerment, kind of like an anti-corruption commission would be. What will probably happen is that in the field of human rights, and this will be done largely because Burma knows it has a human rights image problem. Human rights in Burma have been atrocious for decades. Burma is now trying to re-enter the company of regional organizations and international organizations like ASEAN or the UN. ASEAN is in the midst of creating a human rights mechanism. So if Burma wants to move closer to ASEAN, largely to shield itself from pressure, say, from China, it also has to embrace, to a certain extent, the human rights principles being developed in ASEAN. The same is true of the United Nations. So there is that kind of indirect pressure saying to Burma, look, you've got to get your human rights situation on a better track record. If you don't, we're going to reconsider those sanctions, or it's going to embarrass us, or it's going to weaken ASEAN. Now, you mentioned a number of human rights issues, and what they'll probably have to do is prioritize them. The position of women might be the easiest one. Historically and traditionally, going back, even before the 20th, 19th century, Burmese society has actually always had relative gender equality. It's kind of unique in Southeast Asia that has a long history of, say, female-run households or relative gender parity. So it's not a situation here where somebody has to say, well, let's bring Burma into the modern world and get rid of patriarchy. Aung San Suu Kyi, as a woman who's leading, is not unusual for Burma. So even though the military is I know, dominated by men, that's a much easier sell in Burma to work on things like gender parity. And you get a lot of mileage out of that. It also strengthened Burma's image in the eyes of the rest of Southeast Asia. Economic inequality, that's going to be caught up with things like corruption and economic reforms. Burma really can generate a lot of money. Burma has the money to greatly improve services, to fund education, to build education institutions that could serve the poor, and also to greatly reduce economic inequality. Where has that money been so far? That's the money that gets squandered in corruption. That's why if you start taking care of corruption, all that money starts going into services as opposed to being transformed into a form of private wealth. So there is potential there for that, but that's, again, you have to look at corruption and economic reforms before you can tap into that money and do that. Because what Burma doesn't want to do is become one of those countries that's dependent on foreign aid to do this. So they have the resources, but they'll have to find a way to retool the economy to get at them. The one human rights situation that Burma is going to have to deal with is the one has emerged most recently, and even Aung San Suu Kyi is in a very uncomfortable position over this, and that is the issue that's taking place in the western part of the country, in the province of Arakan, or sometimes called Rakhine. There you have an issue of, there's a minority population in Burma known as the Rohingyas, and they speak a dialect of Bengali related to Bangladesh. The military regime over a decade ago just declared them to be, in essence, non-Burmese citizens. They simply said they're Muslims, they speak a language that's not Burmese, and they're culturally different, and so they, in essence, rendered them stateless people. So, and there's about 2 million of them. So some of them stayed in Burma, denied citizenship, which means denied access to education, denied access to anything. You kind of live this very tenuous existence. Some of them tried to flee as refugees to Bangladesh. Bangladesh doesn't want them. And so you also have small populations of Rohingya refugees in places like Thailand, in places like Malaysia, and they just kind of sit and linger. So they're incredibly frustrated. Well, when you have a democratic transition and people start talking about human rights, this is your chance. We want our rights. But the problem is with almost 2 decades, actually, of being told over and over again that these people are different and they're foreigners, that's creating competition. Now that people are saying, we want citizenship too, we want our share of the resources in one of the regions, the state of Arakan, for instance, that state has a high percentage of poverty. And so people are saying, well, we don't even have our percentage yet. We have to share them with these people. And that's why you're seeing these Muslim-Buddhist clashes. The Rohingyas are mostly Muslims. Burma itself is largely a Buddhist state. And they've got some serious and deadly clashes going on in that region. So here's Aung San Suu Kyi right now in Europe, and that's what what about the human rights of these people? And she's in a tricky situation because a lot of people actually don't like this population of Rohingyas. They really think they're not Burmese. So if Aung San Suu Kyi says they have full human rights as well, she could lose some of her supporters. Or she could alienate the military, because the military right now is saying we have a security problem, we have to do something about it. So she's in a difficult position about how you solve this particular identity-based human rights issue. The military has its solution, but of course nobody wants to see the military sending troops into regions to quell discontent, because it's going to look like a return to the days of the past. So it's actually the biggest and most intractable human rights problem that Burma has now. If there's anything good about this, it is that if they can find a way to resolve this issue successfully, it will not only greatly improve Burma's image in the eyes of Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. It's like, wow, they really pulled that off very well. But it will greatly enhance the trust that people have in Burma in democratic institutions, the ability of those institutions to solve the problems that Burma has.
And solving the problem, what do you see the future of Myanmar? And where is Aung San Suu Kyi in all of this?
Okay. As an optimist, I can tell you what I want to see, which is that I'd want to see good things happen for Burma. Burma is a country, especially the Burmese people, have been through decades of just misery and struggle. And it would be nice if everything I've talked about actually worked. It's not going to be perfect, but if it actually worked, if they could get corruption under control, if you had economic reforms and you started getting some of this money building services and infrastructure in Burma, the Burmese people are the greatest asset Burma has. I mean, for all they've been through, they themselves still have kind of a work ethic and an honesty that is unusual in countries that have been through what Burma's been through. So there's a lot of potential there, and I would love to see all of it work. But if I look at things more pragmatically, or I guess as a more realistic lens, the most important thing for Aung San Suu Kyi right now is to try to be a part of the process and to make sure that this first term, because right now we just had the first elections, April 1st, to make sure that this first term actually doesn't just devolve into an uncooperative government. There's something very important in democracy about getting a good start, building momentum. If you compare it, say, with the Philippines, when Cory Aquino became president after Ferdinand Marcos left in 1986 in the Philippines, her term of presidency was 1986 to 1992. 6 years long. Policy-wise, not much was accomplished. But the most important thing was that as the president, as the elected president, she was not thrown out in a coup, and she made it the full 6 years. You set that tone that says when we elect a president, it will last for 6 years. To be able to do that in Burma, to say we have elections and the government continues. You don't have this thing where people start leaving parties, they try to vote each other out of power, you have coalitions that are unstable. That's what you don't want to see. You want to see elections happen and the government, even if it's slowly, is able to put into place programs that look like they're taking Burma in the right direction. If you can do that and then have the next regularly scheduled elections happen, it doesn't seem exciting, but it really is one of the most exciting things for democracy to say, hey, we can do this. And Aung San Suu Kyi's role is going to be, first of all, she's an opposition leader now. She's got many challenges, one of which is to move from being the individual that she is to being the team player within the National League for Democracy, to in essence position her party as a force that has staying power. If you attach everything to her person, then the fortune of your whole party rises and falls with Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi is aware of this, which is good. And so the idea is to turn the National League for Democracy, get people to think in terms of the party and its platform as opposed to just, oh, I like Aung San Suu Kyi, so I'll vote for this or that. So the good news is they're moving in that direction. So her role is also as a very important transitional figure. She's very good at diplomacy. She's negotiating with Thein Sein. She knows the military is there. So she'll choose her battles well, and hopefully that will not only strengthen democracy, but strengthen people's faith in democracy. So if I were to look at the next big point in Burmese democracy, what's the next big point on the horizon? It would be the next elections, the next regularly scheduled elections. If you can have the first term go through, even if you just have minor successes, we're going to do this and you succeed at doing it, it sends the message that says this might actually work. And it's the next elections, if they're also free and fair, that you'll be able to say, okay, this democracy is going somewhere. So that's the short-term perspective.
And even though if, let's say, the Eurozone gets into a lot of trouble and the US dollar falls flat,
Yeah.
Myanmar will still able to sustain and survive?
I do think it will. And for a long time, Burma had put pretty much all of its eggs in one basket. It was the China basket. I mean, the military was able to stay in power largely because either of direct support from China or because they knew that they had a protective veto in the Security Council, that the UN would never really be able to come after Burma. What Burma has now realized is that that's a very vulnerable position to be in, because if only one country is your, in essence, patron and protector, then that country can ask you to do things like, please send your resources to us only, or do the following things. And so Burma has wisely tried to diversify its economic portfolio. And it has resources. I mentioned this earlier. This makes all the difference in the world. If it didn't have resources, if you compare, say, Burma's situation right now with, say, East Timor does have oil, but it has not been able to develop it yet. So in the meantime, East Timor sits there struggling with a way to keep their economy going. Burma has resources, and they have already been developed. Burma knows how to stay friends with China, but also move towards India. India wants to invest in the region. If the Eurozone falters, if the dollar goes flat, there are other options. Russia is happy to step in. And Burma learned a lesson from depending too heavily on China, which is that if Burma can get someone in their financial planning, the Ministry of Finance, who knows how to play the world economy, they can not only weather very well these collapses of the Eurozone and, say, a weakening dollar, because they can go to other economies because they have something that other economies want. And more importantly, Southeast Asia's economy.
Amazing. And before we end off, what will be the three pieces of advice would you give for those who are exploring Myanmar, and from life lessons that you've learned?
Those who are exploring, you mean anybody? Just ordinary people exploring it? Or?
Yeah, anybody going there to invest or making the trip.
Okay. So I'll do it in three groups. The first would be just your ordinary person. Should I go to Burma? Those would be either tourists or just people who are curious, and my answer is absolutely yes. Tourism used to just be run by the military, and there was always an ethical thing about should I go to Burma or not. If you ever wanted to go to Burma, now is the time to go. In fact, a lot of people are going, so I'd say plan ahead. But that's actually, it's helpful in multiple ways. It's not just about money. Yes, you bring tourist money into Burma, but that money can be used to further build a tourist infrastructure, and it also gets Burmese people to understand, hey, people do care about what happens to us. We're not just some backwater that nobody cares whether we have the military steps back in. Those kinds of ties, those person-to-person ties, are actually very important. So I would say if you can go, or if you're thinking of going, wherever you are, if you're in Europe or Southeast Asia, it's a great time to go. And I've been to Burma many times, and it's just always been a wonderful experience. Even when the military is in power, wonderful for different reasons. If you're looking to invest, or you're looking to, should I put my money in someplace in Burma? The key thing to look for is, how can I do this in a way that eliminates corruption? Be a part of that process. It's good for Burma, it's good for the Burmese people, and of course, it would be good for the investor. If you're investing money in it, very few people will say, wow, Burma's horribly corrupt, I should invest in that. There are ways to